Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim, also known as Entelecheia, and I am a member of Horizon Lodge Ordo Templi Orientis in Seattle, Washington. Ordo Templi Orientis is an organization whose purpose is to collectively approach, encounter, and magnify the divine by means of the dual paths of fraternity and sacred ritual. The spiritual philosophy which informs all of our work is called Thelema. Thelema is the Greek word for will. It is a spiritual and religious philosophy created by Aleister Crowley. My goal is that by the end of this hour, you possess deep insight and deep understanding of Thelema, by which I mean you have some sense of why someone would want to walk this path, what it means to walk this path, and how one's life might be transformed by walking this path. Per the title of this talk, this path I speak of is a path of erotic liberation. The term liberation implies that we are in a state of captivity or enslavement, which Thelema is intended to free us from. In other words, there's a problem, our captivity or enslavement, to which Thelema is offered as a solution. If you adequately understand the problem, then you should be able to tell how and to what extent Thelema offers a solution. If you understand how and to what extent Thelema offers a solution, then you will have deep insight into what Thelema is for and why someone would want to walk the Thelemic spiritual path. Furthermore, if you recognize the problem I am about to describe as your own, and if you understand how Thelema might solve that problem, then you will understand how Thelema could potentially help you. At the risk of stealing my own thunder, I will tell you at the outset what I plan to show you. The problem Crowley was attempting to solve is the problem of human dissatisfaction generally, what in Buddhism is called the First Noble Truth. The proposed solution offered by Thelema is the radical acceptance or affirmation of existence, which Crowley saw as identical with doing one's will, a phrase which we will explore in depth. This solution is achieved by overcoming the opposition between the will and things external to it, a process which culminates in the erotic unbinding of our sense of separateness from existence. Crowley called the method by which this is achieved love under will, or magic. Let's look at each piece of this puzzle in turn. The problem Thelema is intended to solve is the deepest problem there is. It's the fact that we're born into a world in which we are subject to influences and conditions beyond our control, many of which cause us stress and pain. By virtue of having bodies, we are subject to injury, sickness, aging, infirmity, and ultimately death. People and things we love go away, are unreliable, or die. Things which annoy or harm us make themselves present unbidden. In short, we suffer stress and dissatisfaction. If you yourself are not currently suffering, you will. At the very least, you probably know someone who is right now. The solution one proposes to the problem of suffering will depend in large part on what one thinks the ultimate cause of suffering is. Christianity locates the problem in the original sin of Adam and Eve, who, having disobeyed God and eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, were stricken with the curses of self-awareness, labor, pain in childbirth, and death. According to Christianity, liberation is to be sought in the cleansing of this original sin through the blood shed by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Placing one's faith in Jesus ensures a second birth in this life and avoidance of a second death in the fires of hell. Another possible response is to decide that life is just a bitch. There is no salvation, and it doesn't matter what you do, say, think, or feel. This is the response of nihilism, which many of us find naturally when we're about 15 or 16 years old. By contrast, the Buddha's approach was more optimistic than the nihilist approach, but more DIY than the Christian approach. He believed the cause of suffering was to be found in the way the individual human being related to existence. The problem, he said, is that human beings crave or desire that things should be a certain way. We want to hold on to pleasant things, push away painful things, and ignore boring things. The problem is that we can only ever achieve so much control over things outside of us and even within us in our own heads. The universe is in a state of ceaseless change, and those changes occur because of conditions entirely outside our control. However, if we come to a thorough and complete understanding of the nature of things, in other words, if we can learn at a deep level that reality is necessarily bound to disappoint us, we will become disillusioned with the universe and cease attempting to get any joy out of it. At that moment, our minds will abandon the unreliable universe and instead embrace that which does not change, which in Buddhism is called nibbana or nirvana. Now, as it turns out, Aleister Crowley agreed with a lot of this, at least up to a point. He was sensitive to the fact that life can be quite terrible when you get right down to it. He understood well the temptation of nihilism. Search as you may, you will find no toxic positivity in Crowley's writings. And like the Buddha, he agreed that the problem arose primarily from craving, in particular by expecting a constantly changing universe was bound to meet our expectations for it. Like the Buddha, Crowley recognized that disillusionment and a clear understanding of the nature of reality were important motivators of liberation. Yet while the Buddha's solution required the progressive renunciation of the universe, Crowley's proposed path went 180 degrees in the opposite direction. From both the Buddha's and Crowley's perspectives, reality is like a violent, turbulent hurricane. But while the Buddha taught a path of retreat from the storm and from reality, Crowley taught something different. Crowley's proposed path to freedom goes directly into the storm itself. If the Buddhist path to liberation required the unconditional renunciation of change, the Thelemic path, according to Crowley, was going to entail the unconditional acceptance of change, an open-hearted embrace of every change whatsoever. It's a valiant journey into the eye of the hurricane. So Crowley accepted the Buddha's premises and his conclusion. He just realized there was another way to accomplish the same thing. Paradoxically, it went in the exact opposite direction the Buddha proposed, but it arrived at a similar end state of total liberation from conditions. In other words, you're either all in or you're all out. Be a Thelemite, be a Buddhist, either one works. Just whatever you do, don't try to stand in the middle. If you try to stand in the middle, you're now in the position of trying to cut a course through life that seeks pleasure and avoids pain. You're necessarily in a position of attempting to control outcomes which, in principle, can never be fully guaranteed. This requires one to employ strategies to control and dominate life, which requires one to separate oneself from nature. It means erecting a wall around oneself that lets in pleasure and keeps out pain. It means imposing one's will on reality. Crowley had a word he used to describe this attitude toward life. He called it evil. Crowley never used that word except in this very precise, technical sense. Everything I'm about to teach you about the Thelemic path of liberation is about destroying evil in one form or another. And whenever I talk about evil, there's nothing inherently moral attached to it. I mean it in this precise, technical sense of opposing one thing to another, of creating arbitrary divisions between things and between oneself and the world. He also had a name for those who adhered to this path in life. He called them Black Brothers or left-hand path adherents. When we talk about left-hand path these days, we mean Satanists or people who practice Tantra. That is not what Crowley meant at all. He meant those who attempt to have it both ways, and who as a result wall themselves off from the flow of life, from what Crowley taught was the cosmic feminine. And as a result, they have to constantly impose their will on things to preserve their individuality. The opposite of being a Black brother, and therefore the personification of goodness or holiness in Thelema, is to be a saint. But these aren't your parents' saints. Crowley meant something very different from a goody-good. Rather than imposing their wills on reality, rather than trying to control how much life or joy accrues to them, the saints have turned that control over to the universe itself. Rather than asserting their individuality over and against reality, the saint has sacrificed that individuality in erotic union with the divine feminine, which Crowley calls Babylon. Their sense of separateness has been undone through love, and as a result, they are now free. Hence, the trail Crowley blazed is a path of erotic liberation. This contrast is very important. There is nothing in Thelema more fundamental than this, so let me repeat it. The personification of evil in Thelema is the person who insists upon their separation from life, who Crowley refers to as the Black Brother. Just to be clear, there's no racial connotation here, and it doesn't even have anything to do with what is commonly called black magic. He's talking about individuals who assert their individuality against time. The personification of goodness or holiness is the saint. And to be clearer still, this has nothing to do with being a moral prig. Crowley means those who have sacrificed their individuality, meaning there is no longer anything standing between them and the universe. Their hearts are open, and they unconditionally affirm existence. Regardless of whatever misfortune befalls them, they no longer experience resentment. While they may not be free of physical pain, they are free of existential despair. If you understand this contrast, you understand Thelema from Crowley's point of view. In Ordo Templi Orientis, we do a beautiful ritual called the Gnostic Mass, which celebrates this spiritual achievement. In it, a priest devotes his will solely and exclusively to Babylon, who is represented by a priestess. He ceremonially relinquishes control over his own life, and he relinquishes control over his own joy. He offers these up to the universe, essentially declaring them no longer to be his own. At the climax of the ritual, they are ecstatically ripped from him through a sublimated act of coitus. But then something quite remarkable happens. Kneeling before the priestess, who in this case represents the universe itself, he receives all of it back. Only this time, it is the life of the sun and the joy of the earth that are given back to him by the priestess. His small pleasures have been returned to him as the bounties of heaven and earth themselves. In other words, having released the stranglehold he once had over life, he experiences life and joy almost as if for the first time. One might say, almost like a child. He is finally and truly free. Now, having explained and hopefully made vivid to you what the pinnacle of all this is supposed to look like, let's back up and see how one gets there. I had to start at the end because it is only at the end that it is really clear what all of this is about. But now let's bring it back down to earth so that you can see approximately how Crowley expected one to go from the condition of an ordinary human being to actually being free. Crowley called the process by means of which the ordinary human being achieves liberation through ecstatic union with the divine, love under will, or magic. He also referred to it as the accomplishment of the great work. The term great work originally comes from the alchemical tradition, where it is used to describe the creation of the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone was a mythical substance capable of turning base metals such as mercury into gold. The process of the great work describes the exaltation of the first matter into something divine. From a Thelemic point of view, the first matter which must be exalted is the individual human being. And rather than transform base metals into gold, the exalted or divine human being transforms suffering into joy, resentment into affirmation. This exaltation occurs when the microcosm, or the individual, models him or herself on the structure of the macrocosm, or the universe. The universe as a whole is divine. If you want to become divine, you need to become like the universe. But what exactly do we mean when we say the universe is divine? Until relatively recently, people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and they thought the planets, the sun, and the stars all moved around it. They appreciated neither the enormity of the universe, spatially or temporally, nor the impersonal, mathematical laws by which it operated. Aleister Crowley sought to reestablish the idea of the great work and the divinity of the individual on more modern, scientific grounds. He believed that view of the universe was reflected in poetic, dramatic, and spiritual terms in a short book called Liber El Vel Legis sub Figura 220, otherwise known as the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law is the foundational text of Thelema. All the essential teachings of Thelema ultimately derive from the Book of the Law. One of the many things Crowley said about this book is that it explains the universe. So what exactly does it say about the universe? The Book of the Law describes the world as being composed of two divinities. On the one hand, there is the sum total of all possibilities, represented by the Egyptian sky goddess Nuit. And on the other hand, there is the subjective point of view on any of those possibilities. In other words, the first-person perspective which each of you is acquainted with right now, represented by the Egyptian solar god Hadit. It is the combination of Nuit and Hadit which gives rise to experience. The image depicted here is the stele of Ankh-Nakhonsu, otherwise known as the stele of revealing. It depicts the priest Ankh-Nakhonsu, the man on the right, making offering to Horus, who you see seated on the left. The woman arched over the top is sky goddess Nuit, who in Thelema represents all that is possible. Right underneath her, around where her navel would be, is the winged solar disk Hadit, who in Thelema represents the subjective first-person point of view. Anything you are aware of or could be aware of is Nuit, and therefore, from a magical point of view, is cosmically feminine. We can represent her as a sphere or as a circle since she surrounds us. From your perspective right now, I am Nuit, even though I am male. The sound of my voice is Nuit. The sensation of your body on the chair is Nuit. Whether you are male or female, your physical body is Nuit. Even your thoughts and feelings are Nuit because they are experienced by you. In short, anything you experience or could experience is Nuit. The one doing the experiencing, that's Hadit. We will represent him with a small circle, but for reasons which I'll explain later, it's better to think of him as an infinitely small point or not anything at all. Whether you are male or female, your consciousness is Hadit and therefore magically male. If you attempt to reflect on your consciousness, if you turn it into an object of awareness, the thing you are aware of is not Hadit. It's Nuit. Anything you are aware of is Nuit. The thing which is aware is Hadit. Hadit can never know himself. He can only ever know Nuit. Conversely, if Hadit is aware of anything, it is always Nuit. In addition to explaining the universe, Crowley also said the Book of the Law directed each person to realize one's own godhead in each and every experience. By that, he meant that the Book of the Law teaches us that we should seek to be or identify with Hadit. Now, you might think to yourself, how could I help being anything other than Hadit? The answer is you can't. You just don't know it. Not really. It's human nature to confuse ourselves with the things we're aware of. So we tend to identify with our bodies. We identify with our desires. We identify with our aspirations. We identify with things that have happened to us. We identify with our emotions. We identify with our thoughts. All of these things we identify ourselves with are sensations. They are things which we experience. But it is impossible for one sensation to experience another sensation. Assuming you have the power of sight, you can see things right now. The room you're in, maybe the presentation in front of you. You can also hear my voice. but you don't really believe the visual sensation you're having right now is hearing my voice, that a sound is being relayed back to your mental image of a screen. That just doesn't make any sense. But when we identify with sensations, even if those sensations are subtle things like deeply private thoughts or an inner sense of an observer or thinker, that's essentially what we're assuming. We're assuming some part of our experience is capable of observing another part of our experience. We're assuming one sensation somehow reflects another sensation or is receiving another sensation, but that's impossible. Crowley called these kinds of errors creases or folds within our magical garment. It's a poetic way of saying the same thing. He said such folds or creases had the effect of concealing the light of Hadith within us. To identify ourselves as Hadith and to smooth these folds were one and the same thing. At this point, we can state what evil means in a Thelemic sense more precisely, and by contrast, state more precisely what the liberation of the saint is. We said earlier that evil means restriction. It means taking one part of reality and arbitrarily separating it or walling it off from another part of reality. But that is precisely what happens when we identify some part of Nuit as self and oppose it to some other part we call other. Notice a few things here. First, once again, there is no moral connotation to this notion of evil. Thelemic evil has to do with a confusion about the nature of fundamental reality. It has nothing to do with harming anyone or breaking any moral laws. Secondly, the Black brothers' assertion of their individuality in the face of time must fail. What they take to be themselves is necessarily in time, because it is part of Nuit and is subject to her laws, not theirs. 3, when we identify ourselves with some part of Nuit, we are identifying ourselves with some particular impermanent thing. But as we saw earlier, this is an essential reason why we suffer in the first place. We're trying to make a permanent state of affairs out of something that is constantly changing. So evil is the cause of suffering, and destroying evil will necessarily bring suffering to an end and liberate us. So what happens when we clear up this confusion? The first thing is that she, Nuit, becomes whole. She is experienced beyond the false dualities we have imposed upon her. When we are no longer under the mistaken impression that some part of her is observing some other part, all sensations, all things whatsoever, are understood to be part of a unified field of experience. The sameness and self-sufficiency of all things is appreciated. Second, now that we no longer confuse ourselves with some aspect of Nuit, our true selves become apparent to us. We know once and for all that we are not our bodies, not our feelings, not our memories, not our aspirations, not our thoughts, not any sensation whatsoever. We know that we are Hadith. Now, I said earlier that this diagram was not quite accurate. Hadith is represented by a small oval. But Crowley really says he is an infinitely small point. Hadith, the self, the observer, the doer, is no thing whatsoever. So in any experience of the world, there is only the experiencing, the thing experienced, but there is in reality no separate thing or object or sensation doing the observing. The self is completely insubstantial. In the seeing, only the seen. In the hearing, only the heard. In the thinking, only the thought. In other words, there is no sense of a separate observer at all. How then do we represent the relationship between Nuit and Hadith? Can we even really represent it? The true nature of experience is that there is no separation between things. There is no independent observer. Hadith has no nature of his own other than to go toward Nuit, to continually dissolve in ecstasy in her. Each moment is orgasmic union with her. You think you live in a world of tables, chairs, subatomic particles, Wednesdays, and anticipated unemployment checks. You're wrong. You live in a world of orgasms. You can't see that because you are critically wrong about who and what you are. Basically, your ego is in the way. The apparent folds in the garment of experience are obscuring this. As Crowley says, Hadit knows Nuit by virtue of his going or love. It is therefore wrong to worship Hadit. One is to be Hadit and worship her. Keeping in mind that Nuit is whatever could possibly be experienced, to be Hadit means to embrace each and every experience, every change from one thing into another, as just another manifestation of one's beloved, whether it's a bouquet of roses, a suitcase full of $100 bills, a stomach virus, or an exchange of intercontinental ballistic missiles. To be Hadit means to affirm it. Being Hadit means to accept, to affirm all. But how exactly does one begin the journey? There are many ways to divide up the Thelemic spiritual path. I'm going to use a simplified path that Crowley describes in an essay called A Sandal. There, Crowley divides the path up into 4 stages, which he calls liberty, love, life, and light. Crowley considered these 4 to be emanations of the law, which is Thelema itself. Don't worry too much what all of that means. Just know that there are 4 stages. Each one takes you closer to the eye of the storm and total liberation. And each has a name roughly descriptive of what one has to come to terms with in it. Here's our trusty pyramid again. At the top, we still have our main problem, human suffering and dissatisfaction generally, represented by the black Pac-Man, and we have Thelema fitted to it as the solution. Only now the solution has been divided up into 4 stages, each one a step on the path toward erotic abandonment to the universe. In each of these 4 stages, one is overcoming a particular form of evil, which you now know means arbitrary limitation between one thing and any other thing, the fundamental mistake of all unenlightened human experience. The first stage is called liberty. The stage is largely concerned with ridding ourselves of arbitrary expectations of our conduct and how we ought to spend our time. This stage is about overcoming evil or restriction within oneself, which tends to manifest itself as ambivalence or desiring 2 outcomes simultaneously. For instance, you agree to your wife's request to clean the garage after work, but you conveniently forget it and watch TV instead. That's a classic example of ambivalence, specifically passive aggression. Or you experience a conflict between your desire to be in a rock band and your family's expectation that you join a convent. This internal conflict or evil is overcome when thought, feeling, speech, and action are in perfect alignment and accord with your nature as an individual human being. This is the state that Crowley refers to as doing one's will. Doing your will is first and foremost about having internal consistency, or what we might call integrity. You can find out the strength of your will in the Thelemic sense by entering into situations that tempt you to abandon it. For example, those situations where you are tempted to be dishonest or inauthentic. If you've ever watched the Showtime series Dexter, that's basically what that show is about. The whole series is about Dexter's uncomfortable relationship with his own true will because of the expectations of society and people closest to him. The fact that he's a serial killer makes the contrast more vivid, but it's a basic conflict most people can relate to on some level. Doing your will has less to do with which path you ought to take in life, like whether you ought to be a Satanist or a dentist, or what sort of person you should start an alpaca farm with. This is because paths in life are necessarily dependent upon external circumstances, and external circumstances are constantly changing. What doesn't change is the law governing exactly who and what you are, and that's what your will is. It's primarily internal, secondarily external. This is important because being confused about which way to go in life doesn't necessarily mean you don't know your will. It means you're confused about how to apply knowledge of your will to the situation you're faced with. That's different from not knowing who or what you are or what you stand for. Of course, you may be completely ignorant of that too, in which case you're in a lot of trouble. And so your first order of business as a human being, whether you intend to walk the Thelemic spiritual path or not, is to pull it together, as they say, and get yourself in the habit of living a life full of integrity, which has less to do with which way you choose to go in life and more to do with how much character you bring along with you for the journey. If all you gain from Thelema is this self-possession and stability of character in the face of life, that's quite an accomplishment on its own. Many people never even try to do that, let alone succeed. This is obviously a lifelong task, one which is complete only with death. However, this does not mean you have to have perfect character or wait for death to progress along the spiritual path. From the perspective of the path of erotic liberation, what's important is that you learn how to gather your internal resources and direct them exclusively toward that one object. In other words, from the perspective of mysticism, which is what the rest of this path is about, all we need to concern ourselves with from an ethical point of view is what aids or hinders concentration. What's happening in this first stage is that everything you are, or more accurately, everything you think you are, is gradually becoming subordinated to the hadith within you. Your physical body, your emotions, your thoughts, your desires, your path through the universe, all of this is just a vehicle for the divine part of you, hadith, to experience the universe, who is Nuit. The problem, as we saw, is that this vehicle also has a tendency to get in the way. It's like a vehicle that hasn't had its wheels aligned in a while, which makes a lot of noise under the hood, and which has a tailpipe that drags along the ground. It's kind of a drag for hadith. A lot of us have probably wished at one time or another that we could trade our cars in. But whatever this incarnation has bequeathed you, the first order of business is to get the wheels aligned, tighten the screws, get the muffler attached properly, and maybe clean the windshield and fix the air conditioner while we're at it. At this point in the game, we think we're doing this for ourselves. And we are, but we think we're the car rather than the person driving the car. Or more accurately, sometimes we think we're the car. Sometimes we think we're the steering wheel. Sometimes we think we're the front driver's side wheel. And sometimes we think we're the alternator. We're really confused. So the first order of business is to get our act together, to become one car with one driver, not a car with wheels about to fly off. So now the question is, where exactly is the car supposed to go? This brings us to the second stage of the path, which is called love. In the ritual I mentioned earlier, the Gnostic Mass, there is a part at the beginning where the priestess, who again represents the cosmic feminine, kneels before the priest and strokes his lance 11 times. Shortly thereafter, he raises the lance. The symbolism isn't exactly subtle. She's gotten him ready to love. But to love what exactly? To love her, to love everything, to love all. Among other things, the lance is the priest's will. When the lance is down at the beginning, it's not unlike our example of the car with the wheels about to fly off. But when she strokes the lance, she is consecrating it. She is devoting it to its true object, the only thing in the universe which it really, truly, deeply desires, her. From that point on in the ritual, there's only one place that lance can possibly end up, and that's in her cup. That will is now on a one-way trip, which ends in erotic dissolution in the divine feminine. As you may have guessed, there is nothing sentimental implied by love in the Thelemic sense. Sentimentality arises from attachment. The kind of love Crowley was interested in was not an attachment to any one thing or person. It was a drive toward union with nothing less than everything. That includes coronavirus as much as it includes daisies. No one has ever gotten sentimental over coronavirus, and I'm sure no one ever will. Now, there are two ways in which this union between consciousness and the world can be carried out. And this is where we start to get into the specific techniques Crowley experimented with and taught. The first, probably more familiar way, is through meditation. If you sit down and practice quieting your mind, perhaps by focusing on the breath, on a colored disc, on a candle flame, or upon a word, you will, after some time, enter into a state of meditative absorption, which is called samadhi, or concentration. This state of concentration will initially be accompanied by intense joy and rapture, but eventually it will become a calmer, more neutral state. From there, different qualities of mind can be investigated and understood to be devoid of self. Buddhists are connoisseurs of these meditative states. It's very easy nowadays to find someone who can teach you samadhi. 120 years ago, that was not the case, and so Crowley had to go to India to learn. That made him an early pioneer in the West of these techniques. The second way to achieve union is by doing magic. By magic, Crowley didn't mean these uninspired ceremonies where you draw a shape or two in the air while mispronouncing Hebrew. He meant working yourself up into a frenzy that carries you out and away from yourself and into union with God. Crowley rediscovered a way of doing ceremonial magic that was much more like what we might call shamanism. He tended to gloss this as inflaming thyself in prayer. This could be done by chanting the spirit's name like a mantra. It could be done by rocking back and forth. It could be done by singing. It could be aided greatly by hashish and other mind-altering drugs. And eventually he realized it could be done by fucking. Once he did, that became his preferred method for the rest of his life. So you have two paths, both of which lead to the same destination. You've got the path of stillness leading to eternity. That's the path of meditation, which we might also call the reflective path, the path of making the mind still like water. And you've got the path of ecstasy leading to eternity. That's the path of ecstatic magic, which Crowley at one point attributes to the Gnostic god O.T.O. Both of these paths are illustrated on this diagram of mine, which is based on an original by Crowley. The upright red triangle is the path of magic, and it has the Hebrew letters Yod, Aleph, and Vav in it, spelling E-A-O. The blue downward pointing triangle is the path of meditative reflection, the path of stilling the mind. In it is the Hebrew letter He 3 times, denoting this as an archetypically feminine path. Around the outside, written in Latin, it says, Sunt duo modi per quos homo fit deus tohu et bohu, mens quasi flamma sugat aut quasi putis aquae quiescat. Crowley translated this as, two are the methods of becoming God, the upright and the averse. Let the mind become as a flame or as a well of still water. In the center of the figure is an 8-pointed star, symbol of the Messiah, the Savior. The Savior in Thelema is not Jesus, but the holy guardian angel. Wrapped around the whole figure is the Ouroboros, the serpent swallowing its tail. I will return to the serpent and the angel in just a moment. But whichever way one chooses to affect the union, the first time it occurs, it is an experience of the oneness and beauty of all things, which is accompanied by bliss and rapture. Crowley referred to this as the beatific vision, or the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. The holy guardian angel is one of the most sacred mysteries in Thelema. I cannot really do it justice in this short talk. If you wish to understand what the holy guardian angel is and what its influence in your life could mean to you, read a book called Liber Cordis Cincti Serpenti sub figura Adonai, the English translation of which is The Book of the Heart Girt with a Serpent under the figure Adonai. It's also called Book 65, since the Hebrew letters that spell Adonai add up to 65. As the title of the book suggests, the holy guardian angel is like a serpent which wraps itself around you, the heart. This suggests a reversal of meaning from what one might expect if they were raised Christian. The serpent, with its poisonous bite and tendency to conceal itself in the grass or by hanging dangerously from trees, is a symbol of deception and of evil. Yet in the context of Thelema, it is a symbol of the holy guardian angel, the spirit of erotic liberation. This inversion of the symbol of the serpent Its transformation from a symbol of evil into a symbol of liberation is one of the core distinctive features of Thelemic spirituality. But this deification of the serpent does not transform it into a force for good. It does not make it a friend. The characteristic mode of behavior of the serpent is still to destroy, to poison. So the turn toward the divine in the stage of love, while initially beautiful and joyful, eventually reveals itself as a turn toward seeming destruction, toward darkness. This is far and away one of the most difficult aspects of Thelema to grasp. It's paradoxical in the extreme. The idea here is that the greatest healing power is to be found in the most destructive poison, that the greatest light is to be found in the most profound dark, and that God is to be found in total surrender to something that might be experienced as potentially demonic. I will not try to resolve this paradox. All I will do instead is point back to one of the themes of this talk. The illusion that we really have control over our lives is potent. The abandonment of that sense of control through surrender to a reality which is in ceaseless turmoil is bound to be experienced as quite frightening, at least at first. From the perspective of the ego, what's coming can only look like death. All of which leads me by way to another paradox, to the third part of our journey, which Crowley calls the ordeal of life. In the stage of love, the will turned toward its one true object, which is the all, and it united with it in a peak experience of beauty and rapture. But peak experiences are just that. They're singular experiences. And even an experience as holy as the beatific vision fades away, and we are once again deposited back down into our ordinary lives. Now the will is faced with a new delusion, a new duality, a new form of evil. It's the dualism that arises between the rapturous religious experience on the one hand, which is exceedingly pleasant, and the rest of life on the other, which can seem quite boring, painful, and meaningless by comparison. The temptation here will be to try to return again and again to the beatific vision, to recreate peak unitary experiences. There can be a strong motivation here to renounce ordinary life, to quit liquor and sex, to take monastic vows, to say to hell with it to the ordinary world. This is a result of one having gotten a glimpse, if only for a moment, of an unconditioned reality which can offer real peace and bliss. And indeed, monastic communities exist to support such seekers in their quests, if that quest is a renunciate one. But from a Thelemic point of view, the task now is to see that all things, not just ecstatic peak religious experiences, are divine. This means deliberately exposing oneself to things which cause fear, pain, disgust, shame, and the like. As Crowley says, one must learn to endure them, then to become indifferent to them, then to analyze them until they give pleasure and instruction, and finally to appreciate them for their own sake as aspects of truth. Crowley's own experiments in this regard, documented in his diaries and his poetry as an obsession with deviant sex acts, especially coprophagy, are legendary. But it is wrong to see them as mere kinks. They were deliberate attempts on his part to shatter his reflexive belief in the notions of good and bad. The idea isn't to do things that cause harm to yourself or others. For instance, you shouldn't jump in front of a speeding bus in order to unite yourself mystically with it, or drink a vial of acid. Instead, you're trying to understand everything on its own terms, to see things from a detached, dispassionate point of view, to elevate yourself to something akin to a God's eye perspective on things. In the stage of love, it was all about gathering the consciousness together and launching it, one pointed at a single thing so as to unite with it. The attention had to remain narrow and focused. In this stage, the stage of life, the attention has to widen. One's awareness must become broad, embracing, and comprehensive of the entire universe of phenomena. At this point, there is a more acute confrontation with death. One must come to terms with the fact that one's own death is just another phase of phenomena, no more or less important than any other change in the universe. It's only the attachment to ego that makes my death seem somehow of more concern than anything else. So what's happening in this stage is that one is taking up a more universal, more detached, more objective perspective on things, although the awareness itself is also becoming disentangled from the particularities of the personality. Hadith more clearly than ever sees the ego as a mere vehicle of its journey through the universe and begins to appreciate more its independence from all conditioned phenomena. Finally, we arrive at the fourth and final leg of our journey, that of light, which is, again, paradoxically, an initiation into darkness or night, which Crowley calls the ordeal of the abyss. This is where one is given the choice to become a left-hand path adherent. That would mean maintaining one's attachment to personality, to the illusion of ego. It means walling oneself off from change and attempting to preserve one's personality in the face of change. Or one can let go, and through a final act of erotic abandon, relinquish all attachment and forfeit one's life and joy into the cup of the goddess Babylon. The left-hand path is ostensibly a path toward union, toward self-possession in the face of change. But the rule of time is universal. There is no way to hide from death. As Crowley describes it, the means by which they attempt to preserve themselves is their very undoing. We saw earlier why that is the case. The unity they seek is ultimately based upon a confusion of Nuit with Hadith, so that with which they identify thoughts, feelings, even the power of willing itself is ultimately subject to change, no matter what. They're misidentifying themselves. So what initially appeared as a path toward union is in reality a path toward dissolution, the ravages of time. The path toward Babylon is ostensibly a path toward night, toward destruction. It is symbolized by emptying out one's blood in the cup of Our Lady, the cup of her fornications. One relinquishes control over one's life, what one considers to be oneself, which can only be seen from the perspective of the ego as a kind of death, a kind of casting of oneself to the four winds. This is described as becoming like a pile of dust. But by relinquishing this false sense of self and by surrendering to universal life, one is able to embrace true life and true joy. One achieves real unity, which is the continual, ongoing unity or unification between the self and the universe, which is experienced as joy. So what initially appeared as a path toward destruction is in reality a path to freedom. The image you see before you is a Dakini, a female wrathful deity from Vajrayana Buddhism. She represents the liberating power of volatile energy and matter. This is an analogous concept to Babylon in Thelema. There is no longer any confusion between Hadith and Nuit in any experience. It's no longer possible to take one part of Nuit, call it self, and oppose it to another part of Nuit and call it world or other. There is no longer any difference made between one thing and another. There is no longer any confusion about who or what one is. We are not some part of Nuit cut off from another part. We are Hadith, the adorer, and we exist only to unite with her. This doesn't mean everything blends into a gray mush. It means all experiences are seen clearly as experiences. We no longer grasp after them or impose our own thoughts and expectations upon them. We are delivered from lust of result. Paradoxically, the sameness of all things releases them to be what they are, without restriction. Craving is done with, and in its place is acceptance and affirmation, a full spectrum reality. The problem with which we began, the suffering that arises from wanting things to be other than what they are, has been overcome. Something akin to nirvana has been achieved, but it has been done through ecstatic abandonment or erotic union with the universe, rather than through a renunciation of the universe. If this is a visual depiction of how you feel having listened to this talk, I apologize. It was not my intent to overwhelm you with information. If you come away with nothing else, know that Crowley thought one could be free of the really basic problems of human existence by cultivating ecstatic union with reality. Crowley called the method for achieving this love under will or magic. It involves a process of progressive unification, of overcoming of opposition, and a final ecstatic dissolution with all, which I refer to as erotic liberation. It results in a state in which there is no longer any mistake about exactly who or what one is, and an unconditional acceptance of change, which overcomes suffering. It's been a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon. I very much appreciated your attention and your patience while I described the Thelemic path of mysticism and magic. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to email me or visit Horizon. I very much look forward to speaking with you again.